I'd like to introduce Kayla Hirtle, speaking on altered states of consciousness, gender, 19th century medical discourse, and Gothic literature.
Vampires, Twilight, True Blood, The Vampire Diaries, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and the many reincarnations of Dracula. When you tell people you are focusing on vampire literature for your dissertation, they automatically think of one of these previously mentioned pop culture renditions of the vampire, aka teenage girls falling in love with 100-year-old sexy vampires. But in my dissertation, I actually focus on the figure of the vampire in literature published before Bram Stoker's 1897 Dracula. But why would I focus on the obscure vampires that come before Dracula if he's the big bad, the most recognizable? Well, because Dracula has been examined critically from just about every angle, but the text that Stoker drew on as source material and the characteristics that we see accumulated in his portrayal of Dracula have received very little critical attention and therefore present as a gap in the study of Gothic literature. So what vampires come before Dracula? As indicated on my slide, the three main texts that I'm studying are Coleridge's Christabel, Polidori's The Vampire, and Le Fanu's Carmilla. And as I've been working with these texts, doing close readings of passages like the one on my slide, I've noticed that there's a change in the way the vampire is characterized between the earlier texts and the later ones. For example, Polidori's vampire Lord Ruthven purposefully attacks young virgins, but Le Fanu's Carmilla only attacks her victims while sleepwalking. So something must happen between the publication of The Vampire and Carmilla to account for the change in attitude surrounding the vampire's intent to harm its victims. And I argue that this change is linked to the rise in mental science in the 19th century. Specifically, the critical factor in this shift is the innovation of anesthesia in 1846, which was a watershed moment for medicine. But what does anesthesia have to do with vampires? Well, what do the Cold War and Marxism have to do with zombies? What scares us most often finds its way into our literature and pop culture as monsters. The 19th century English were terrified of being put under anesthesia for surgery because it meant giving up their human agency, much in the same way you do when you agree to be hypnotized, and thus cause them to question whether their bodies are self-determined or self-automated, and bring them closer to the idea of the vampire. Both are in an altered state of consciousness and questioning their free will. So in my dissertation, I combine a focus on the figure of the vampire in literature with a medical humanities and history of medicine lens. And I began this talk with a focus on pop culture, because that is how we, in society, and people in the 19th century, make sense of the world around us, and why it is so key that we continue to analyze texts like Carmilla, so that the image of the vampire isn't dumbed down to a simple, sparkly sex object, but rather understood within its own medical context and text. Thank you.